Chapter 1, Fastest Growing Population. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the United States of America since 2010 by percentage rate of growth. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the Asian American population in 2015 was estimated to be 21 million people, and by 2050 projected to be 42.1 million people. In other words, the Asian American population will double in 35 years. How can we, the church, be prepared for this explosive growth? Before we jump ahead and come up with ideas for what we could do to respond, it is important to take a look at the Asian American population for its history, growth, geography, and diversity. History. The term Asian Americans refers to American citizens with Asian descent, based on the U.S. Census racial category of Asian, defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. This is one of 5 categories used in the U.S. Census: white, Black, or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. A census is taken by the U.S. government every 10 years to gather population data to support its policies. Taking a census is not particularly unusual, as it was done in biblical times too, even around the time Jesus was born. As the Christmas story is retold every year, the passage in Luke 2 starts with a description of a census. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. In their own words, the U.S. government described its purpose for census. Information on race is required for many federal programs and is critical in making policy decisions, particularly for civil rights. States use these data to meet legislative redistricting principles. Race data are useful to promote equal employment opportunities and to assess racial disparities in health and environmental risks. However, while disregarding its own declaration, what the U.S. government has done in its policymaking with Asian Americans historically has been tainted with discriminatory injustice. 3 of the most notable ones were the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which prohibited the immigration of Chinese laborers until 1943, the Japanese American internment camps during World War II, and the anti-miscegenation laws that banned interracial marriage until 1967. In addition to its past history of legislative discrimination, many Asian Americans have a shared experience of discrimination on a personal and societal level. People make insensitive remarks about others based on how they look, talk, or what they eat. I still hear stories from American-born Asian Americans, even though they're 5th generation, about being asked the question, "Where are you from?" And when they respond with California or New York, they're asked again, "No, where are you really from?" Or receiving comments such as, "Oh, your English is so good." Whether these racially insensitive remarks are intentional or not, they are hurtful and wrong. Justice. The Asian American Church is uniquely positioned to advocate for the social justice of our community as an integral part of our Christian witness in the world as we proclaim the good news of the gospel. Jesus described his work, social justice, when he read from the Old Testament scriptures, Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2, in Luke chapter 4, 18 and 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Social justice is also listed in the short list of 3 essential requirements God has for all mankind, as it plainly states in Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Plus, the Christian church has a historical precedence for being active in fighting for social justice. In fact, Orthodox Christians have long recognized in Scripture a call to defend and uphold the dignity and well-being of all persons, especially the poor and powerless. Take, for example, John Wesley, who led prison reform and abolitionist movements in 18th century England. More recently, evangelical leaders like Ron Sider and Jim Wallace have promoted Christian engagement in anti-war, environmental, and immigration causes. Growth. The Asian American population has grown most dramatically since 1965 due to the U.S. government's changing immigration policies. Pew Research Center explains it as follows. Large-scale immigration from Asia did not take off until the passage of the landmark Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Over the decades, this modern wave of immigrants from Asia has increasingly become more skilled and educated. Today, recent arrivals from Asia are nearly twice as likely as those who came 3 decades ago to have a college degree, and many go into high-paying fields such as science, engineering, medicine, and finance. This evolution has been spurred by changes in U.S. immigration policies and labor markets, by political liberalization and economic growth in the sending countries, and by the force of globalization in an ever more digitally interconnected world. In 2014, the Asian American population was estimated at 20 million. These large numbers are hard to imagine. Let's do some comparison. The entire population of the entire state of New York is estimated at 20 million in 2014. That's the same number of Asian Americans living in all 50 states. By 2050, the Asian American population is projected to exceed 42.1 million. Proportionally, Asian Americans currently make up about 5% of the US population, and that will almost double to 11% by 2050. On the whole, the American population is projected by 2043 to be multi-ethnically diverse with no racial majority. How is the Asian American population growing faster than the other racial groups? Very simply, there are essentially two reasons for any population growth: reproduction, typically measured as the birth rate, and immigration. And this shared history of immigration is what a majority of Asian Americans have in common, with 74% of Asian American adults being foreign-born. Even as the economy in parts of Asia has dramatically improved in recent years, many Asians have kept immigrating to America. Have you noticed where things are made and manufactured today? Over the past 5 to 10 years, it's as if almost everything I have is made in China. The MacBook I'm typing on, my cell phone, my clothes, my furniture, my kitchenware, and so on. Perhaps you've noticed this too. Who would have imagined that China-based Lenovo would buy out the all-American personal computer business brand, IBM? And you may already recognize these global brands that originate from South Korea: Samsung, Kia, Hyundai, and LG. Not to mention the many global brands from Japan that have endured many decades, like Sony, Toyota, Honda, Canon, Nissan, and Panasonic. This would suggest the economic opportunity is not the only reason for Asian immigration. There are actually many other reasons for making the dramatic change from one's native country in Asia to immigrate to a vastly different country like the United States. These reasons include family reunification, better educational opportunities, freedom and safety from political and religious oppression, etc. In other words, it could be said that even Asians pursue the American dream. There's another reason for population change in a community that should be noted: migration. The population of the United States is considered highly mobile, and the Census Bureau collects data on the rate of migration, known as geographic mobility. Between 2011 and 2012, 12% of Americans moved at least once. This probably affects you or someone you know. One research found that the average American moves 11 times in a lifetime. Correspondingly, 1 in 8 Americans every year is moving from their current home to live somewhere else, whether moving within their city or county, or moving to another part of the state, or an entirely different state altogether. When and where people move have a significant impact on the local demographics and economies of the places where they moved from and where they now live. This geographic mobility of Asian Americans, whether internationally or domestically, can have a significant impact on the local church. 2 things to note here. First, Asians in America are much more receptive to Christianity than their home country in Asia. The next chapter will take a closer look at the statistics that illustrate this. Second, people in general are more receptive when they have relocated to a new community, especially a new country. People moving into a new community is a tremendous ministry opportunity for churches to be strategic and intentional in having ministries that welcome them by providing assistance for practical needs of relocating. It is fairly common for Asian churches to provide assistance with language translation, English classes, free legal advice, and other related social services. Let's take a look where Asian Americans are living in the United States. Geography. The chart below illustrates the proportion of where Asian Americans live in 4 U.S. regions. The largest percentage of Asian Americans, 47%, live in the western United States, with the highest concentration in California and Hawaii. But that also means 53% of Asian Americans live outside of the West, with 11% in the Midwest, 20% in the Northeast, and 21% in the South. When considering where Asian Americans live in regards to a ministry, we should not focus only on the West Coast, but see the entire dispersion of Asian American population in the United States. The Pew Report also noted residential settlement patterns vary greatly among different country of origin groups. The West is home to most Japanese Americans, 71%, and most Filipino Americans, 66%. Chinese, Vietnamese, and Koreans are more likely to settle in the West than any other region. In most U.S. states, English is the most spoken language and Spanish is the second most spoken language. But notice how many states have an Asian language that is the third most spoken language, as illustrated in this chart of most commonly spoken languages beside English and Spanish. Did you know that Vietnamese is the third most spoken language in Washington, Texas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska? And Korean is the third most spoken language in Georgia and Virginia? Notice the large Chinese-speaking population in New York and Hmong-speaking population in Minnesota. And there are large populations of Tagalog-speaking Filipino in California, Nevada, and Hawaii. What does all this mean? Here's a couple of thoughts. If a ministry of opportunity to Asian Americans doesn't open up in California or one of the other Western states for someone looking to serve the community, there are plenty of opportunities elsewhere in the United States. And while these demographics have shown the broader distribution of the Asian American population, regionally and state by state, there are very distinct demographics at a local level. You'll want to research the Asian American demographics for your specific location, whether that's for a city, the county, or the metropolitan area, in order to be well prepared for ministering to this population. Here are 3 great resources for finding local demographics. U.S. Census Quick Facts at census.gov/quickfacts, factfinder.census.gov, provides census data by state, county, city, or zip code. City-data.com has aggregated details, profiles, and of all cities in the United States. Diversity. Asian Americans are not all alike. Far from it. The many variety of Asian Americans consist of more than 34 ethnicities, each with vastly different backgrounds, languages, cultures, nationalities, history of immigration, and more. These differences and distinctives are often lost when Asian Americans are grouped together. For instance, the U.S. Census only specifies these 11 Asian ethnicities by name: Asian Indian, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, Hmong, Laotian, Thai, Pakistani, and Cambodian. And then the other Asian category in the census would include the likes of Taiwanese, Bangladeshi, Burmese, Indonesian, Nepalese, Sri Lankan, Malaysian, Bhutanese, Mongolian, Okinawan, Tibetan, Mian, Singaporean, Tamil. Proportionally, 6 Asian ethnicities comprise 83% of Asian American population: Chinese, Filipino, Asian Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese. When the Pew Report, The Rise of Asian Americans, was first published in 2012, it presented statistics on the top Asian American ethnicities that tend to obscure the distinct differences of the other Asian American minorities. The 2013 updated edition provided additional data on 14 smaller Asian ethnicities, with more detailed economic and demographic data for 9 of these groups. When statistics are presented about Asian Americans, be careful not to use the overall general statistics to describe the whole. 17% of the Asian American population consists of many more smaller ethnicities with very different socioeconomic issues. Therefore, different ministry opportunities require different, fine-tuned, contextualized strategies. Why is this important? For one, a majority of Asian Americans do not self-identify as Asian Americans. How this preference is described. The Asian American label has not been embraced by any group of U.S. Asians because they native-born or foreign-born. Most describe themselves by their country of origin, such as Chinese American, Filipino American, or Indian American, rather than by a Pan-Asian label. Overall, just 1 in 5, 19%, say they most often describe themselves as Asian or Asian American, and even fewer, 14%, say they describe themselves as just plain American. Furthermore, to ignore the distinctive cultural differences of this very diverse Asian American population may be racially insensitive, or worse, offensive. These racial insensitivities and offenses occur in pop culture. For example, when a fictitious character is portrayed with a bad Asian accent that is nothing more than a mixed up gibberish. And sadly, insensitive incidents have occurred in American Christianity too. The thing is, unintentional words are just as painful and hurtful in its impact as intentional offenses. Rather than asking the offended why they're being so sensitive, ask why the offender is being so insensitive. Finally, overgeneralizations have perpetuated the model minority myth, where statistical achievement by some Asian Americans have overshadowed the serious social and economic needs of other Asian Americans. A statement such as Asian Americans are the highest income, best educated, and fast-growing racial group in the United States can be mistakenly used to shape policies in government and ministries and churches that leave the needy in need and the hurting still in pain. It's true that on the whole, Asian Americans are more educated and have higher median family income than any other racial group. 49% of Asian Americans have a college degree, or several. Compared with 28% of the US population, the educational level of recent Asian immigrants is even higher, with 61% having a college degree. Plus, Asian Americans have the highest median family income at $66,000, compared with $49,800 for all Americans. But while a sizable number of Asian Americans have achieved much educationally and financially, there are also significant numbers of Asian Americans who are disadvantaged and struggling, especially among Southeast Asians and smaller Asian American groups. Here are a few data points for reference from Asian Nations, the Model Minority Image. Only 20% of Vietnamese Americans have a college degree. Less than 10% of Laotians, Cambodians, and Hmong have a college degree. Almost 40% of all Vietnamese refugees are on public assistance in California. 40% of Cambodians, Hmong, and Laotians receive public assistance in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And from the UCLA Asian American Studies Center, 2015 statistical portrait of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders. 12.7% of the Asian alone population live in poverty. 14.6% of the Asian alone population do not have health insurance coverage. The task of subgrouping. It is feasible, for the sake of easier understanding and reachability, to aggregate these many ethnicities into 3 subgroups for their notable similarities: East Asians, Southeast Asians, and South Asians. East Asians come from China, Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Mongolia. One major reason for them to be known as the East Asians is their shared belief and common practices in Confucianism. Confucianism has deeply influenced the East Asian cultures and its political life. The desire to have a son, respect for one's parents, respect for the elderly, and respect for teachers represent a few of the concepts that arise from Confucian teachings. Confucianism is built on the important hierarchy of 5 relationships for a harmonious society: ruler to subject, father to son, husband to wife, older brother to younger brother, and older friend to younger friend. Southeast Asians are from Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brunei. These countries have varying degrees of historical influence from the West. French in Vietnam, Spanish in the Philippines, and China in Singapore and Malaysia. South Asians are from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. These countries have strong English influence, as they all have been British colonies at some point in history. Deshi, a term describing the people and culture within the Indian subcontinent, is known for its music and dance, as well as its foods and spices. By the numbers. Here's a breakdown of each ethnicity within the Asian American population by number. And that's where you can look at the chart on the website. To learn more about each of these Asian American groups, please refer to Section 2 of the Rise of Asian Americans report, titled Characteristics of Major Asian American Subgroups, for an excellent description of each of the top 6 Asian American groups: Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, with a history of the group's immigration narrative and its characteristics: nativity and citizenship, language, age, marital status, fertility, educational attainment, income, home ownership, poverty status, regional dispersion, and attitudes on life in America. In Section 5 of the same report, there are additional tables titled Characteristics of Smaller U.S. Asian Subgroups, with data for 9 more Asian American groups: Pakistani, Cambodian, Hmong, Thai, Laotian, Bangladeshi, Indonesian, Sri Lankan, and Malaysian, describing economic and demographic characters of those groups. With so many Asian Americans from different countries, each ethnicity also possesses different religious influence and varying degrees of exposure to Christianity. The next chapter will take a look at the faiths and religions of Asians and Asian Americans.